Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning everyone. Welcome to Ungku Aziz Brown Bag webinar session. Alhamdulillah, with Allah's blessing, once again we are able to host another Ungku Aziz Brown Bag webinar series. I am Dr. Azma. I am your moderator for this morning session. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Development Studies, Faculty of Business and Economics, UM. Before I start, I would like to brief everyone that participate in this series on the Ungku Aziz Center and also the purpose of the seminar. The Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies, or in short UAC, has a long-standing history of establishment since 2006, when the Royal Professor Ungku Aziz Chair was actually founded at the Faculty of Economics and Administration then. The center was aimed to honor the contribution of Allahyarham Royal Professor Ungku Aziz in the field of education and economic development, especially rural development and poverty. The center has been created to facilitate the activities of the chair, and since 2016, the center had taken steps to develop and further expand the field of development studies to reflect its interdisciplinary nature, to attract wider participation, to engage with young minds, and also to go beyond a monodisciplinary approach to development. About the Ungku Aziz Brown Bag webinar series 2021. The purpose of this webinar is to provide a platform for Ungku Aziz Research Center grant recipients, also for academics, practitioners, to share their works and also ideas on whatever research that they have done and findings on issues that are relevant to the Ungku Aziz Center aims and objective. Well, today's theme is actually based on the pillar number 6, which is on human security, and that is to understand human security as another dimension of development that has become a global challenge for policymaking in order to design appropriate policy instruments for intervention, both locally and internationally. Okay, we have been very fortunate today to have with us a renowned speaker. I would like to introduce Associate Professor Dr. VGR Chandran, who is currently an Associate Professor of Industrial Development at the Department of Development Studies, and now Faculty of Business and Economics, UM. He has had experience in the field of research with the Malaysian Industry Government Group for High Technology or MITE at the Prime Minister's Department. Also, he had consulted various local and international agencies. He holds a PhD in economics. His research interest is in industrial development, innovation, and technological development. He has explores many research in economics, social, environment, and also environmental implication of industrial development. Okay, about the topics. The topic for today is after 20 years of displacement, the state of displaced community, the case of Taman Permata Putrajaya. And I will read a bit of the abstract. The research is in response to the new surge in Malaysia's narrative of inclusiveness, shared prosperity, and to ensure the balanced development. So this study tracks the forgotten and displaced community of the Indian plantation workers to the state of progress of the community after some 20 years of displacement. The question on socioeconomic status, subjective well-being after a decade of displacement is of interest. The question of this the question of the socioeconomic status and subjective well-being after decade of displacement is of interest since the debate of the selected displaced community is ongoing and no proper assessment was done in the past to assess the actual state of the displaced community. Moreover, the long-standing socioeconomic needs can be identified more clearly by assessing those needs more objectively. So this study intends to fill the gap of inadequate data and information on this community as well as to provide accurate narratives on the well-being of the community, which in the past anecdotal evidence were only made available. So this study is the first to collect such data to measure their socio-economic status and the SWB objectively. So this study attempts to understand the state of socio-economic status and also the intergenerational mobility and the state of SWB of the displaced community. So the presenter, Dr. Chandran, will be given 45 minutes to present the study findings. And following this, we will open the floor for Q&A session. So participants, if you have any question whatsoever, kindly click the Ask a Question button, insert your name and question, and then click Send. So Dr. Chandran, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Azma. I hope that all of you can hear me clearly. Right. Very good morning to all of you, and thank you for attending the seminar, the webinar series. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes, say so about 40 minutes, is talk about the research work that we have engaged in, given the financing by Ungku Aziz Center for Development Studies. The financial support was very critical for us because we have driven this research based on fieldwork to study more about the displaced community, which has been forgotten for the past few years, and to bring some narrative towards what is happening along and among these community members. Yeah? This will be a case study of one particular community that is referring to the Taman Permata community, which has been displaced in 19 late 1980s, sorry 1990s, and the aim is basically to look into what happens to them now after 20 years of displacement, and to kind of objectively measure some of the progress of them in respect to economic conditions and also social conditions of that particular community. But along the way, we also looked into the subjective well-being of the community in that case. Yeah. So I think the reason being is that in many of the policy documents, and even when we um, discuss with the government agencies and so forth, they do not have adequate information and also data to support some of the policy making agenda within the context of government agencies. So for that reason, we looked into bringing some of these evidences so that we can make a more informed decision in terms of policy and so forth. And we have also brought these findings to the attention of the government, especially when they were drafting the 12th Malaysian Plan. And my co-researchers here, it is entirely also, I mean, a part of a PhD journey for one of my students, Suresh. So he is also involved in this research. And the other members include Dr. Sonia and Dr. Siva Chandran from the Department of History. We were also looking at a historical perspective of how this community has moved forward and so forth. But here I'm not going to present the history part of it. I'm going to present more on the condition of the community with regards to their social economy well-being in that context. Yeah. Can we move to the next slide, please? Right. So what I've done is I have outlined the presentation in such a way that I give you some background in terms of introduction, and then I'll give you a bit of brief about the community so that we can put the context in place in order to discuss the way forward for the community itself. But I think we can also draw a lot of lessons out of this case, which can be also be applicable for other communities which have been displaced in the past, or even for future lessons of how we should deal with community that we are displacing due to development process. So I put that context in perspective so that we can somehow, I mean, understand who they are, you know, before going into the details. And then I'll be talking about what is missing currently, say so in the literature, and also among the policy makers circle that we are trying to attempt to fulfill here. Basically, as I told you earlier, it's more on the inadequate data that that is not mean, properly being supplied to the policy makers for them to make a decision. Yeah. And then I'll zoom in into our aims, what we are trying to do here. Then followed by a bit on the survey of how we have done that, the design of the research itself. And I will jump into the key findings. We have a lot of findings, but I'm just putting some of the selected findings that I have within the context of the survey. And I'll try to draw some policy implications out of these key findings. And at the end, I'll close up with informing the audience about what is the outcome of this survey, and also what we have done so far in terms of disseminating this knowledge to the larger public, including to the policymakers. Right. Just to put in perspective in terms of introduction, I think many of us know that development-induced displacement is a major concern among many policymakers. Globally, be it globally or even nationally, even in the context of Malaysia, we are still struggling with, addressing these issues of development-induced displacement, and this is happening more rapidly given the development progress of infrastructure development, for instance, and so on. But of course, we know that this displacement will have some form of social economic consequences to the community itself. In the context of Malaysia, I think urban renewal, which is happening rapidly, and also mega infrastructure projects are of reference here. We have in the past looked into literature, and we have issues of displacement with regards to example, Orang Asli community, the indigenous people, and even in the context of Indian plantation workers. But I think that has been forgotten, and the implication is still there within the context of the society itself. So it's kind of, we need to be more targeted to understand them more, because each of these communities are different. In fact, if you look at the location, proximity, and so on, they are a bit heterogeneous in that sense. So taking a case study approach is a bit important, because you can understand them more, given the nature that each of these communities are different from one another. So I think that is what we are trying to do here. And I think, there are a lot of narratives now which emphasizes on the inclusiveness, the notion about shared prosperity, and also the notion about ensuring that we have a balanced development. And this has been the key kind of themes that is popping up again and again in many of the development policies and also development plans. And I think we are moving to the right direction, but the question is, how do we ensure that we move into inclusiveness? How do we ensure that we have shared prosperity? And how do we ensure that we have balanced development in that context, so that everyone can move forward regardless of your class in that context? So I think for that we require a lot of information, so that we can do a better policy, we can get better policy insights, and we can direct the policy in the right way. So in our case, one such development-induced displacement that we are addressing here is basically the rubber plantation relocations due to the development of cities. Here, prominently, we're looking into the development of Putrajaya, which saw a very large displaced community that are currently located in Taman Permata itself, that is in the district of Dengkil. And I believe that it warrants a lot of investigation for us to have better policy insights, critically to assess the state, what happened to them, and so forth. So that would be the approach that we are taking. In terms of context, the community itself, when the construction of Putrajaya begins, we saw a very large, massive relocation activities. And among them, there are 4 important plantation estates which have been relocated. So meaning to say, about 400 families were involved, and majority of them are Indians. I'm sorry for the typo error here. And was subjected to those relocation. And what happened was that they were the developer has built flats for these families, households, and they have been relocated and put in the flats houses in the vicinity of Taman Permata, Dengkil. That happens during the year 1998 to 1999. So it's about, give and take, about 20 years plus. If you look at the current, if you compare them to current period. So that is a bit of the background. I'm not going to dwell with about more details of the background, but I think this sets a bit of understanding where they come from. So it's basically the relocation of these four plantation for the development purpose, whereby they were relocated in a flat houses in that particular vicinity. And what is missing here is basically with the context of Indian plantation workers. When we search the literature, we have a very, adequate accounts of historical nature of the Indian plantation workers in terms of socioeconomic conditions, and the evidence are ample in that context. But that is so much focused and concentrated on the socioeconomic conditions of the plantation worker during the time when they were in the plantation, but not so much on when they are moved out of the plantation and what happens to them after the relocation process, right? So I think there is a big gap to understand the current state of the Indian plantation workers, although it has been some years in the context of when they've been relocated. Yeah? So I think the account on the current progress of the Indian plantation workers, including their future generation, is entirely missing from the equation in terms of the policy making, including in the policy documents. I think these are some of the targeted community that could be looked into. Even currently in the 12 Malaysian plan, we have a chapter for minorities that includes Indians. I think if we are doing a targeted policy, targeted programs for RMK 12, then this particular community can be a kind of target community because we see quite a strong evidence that they are left out within the context of the learning process. Yeah. So knowing what happened to them after 20 years of displacement is very critical here. At least that can inform policymakers to do a better programs, more targeted programs with adequate evidences that you have within the context of the Indian society. Right? And when we search the literature, we also see only anecdotal evidences which is available for the particular community, and that is mostly in newses, in media reports from time to time. And we don't really see any possible long-term solutions for the community in perspective. Yeah. So without a long-term solution, a one-off solution that you have, like one-off cash payment or cash transfer, for instance, does not work that well within the context of improving the status of the community itself. I think piecemeal approach and support which is given in the past are not the answer in order for us to be more inclusive in the context of the Indian plantation workers, the Indian community. This is in focus with the displaced community of the subject. Yeah, and I think this community also deserves social justice in that context. And we as a research and policymakers have some moral obligation, to present these kind of cases especially for policy change. Yeah, so I don't see that happening too much within the context of the society, the Indian society. There's no strong drive towards policy change to at least reduce the negative consequences that the society is going through. So I think in that perspective, this research will be very important for us to inform policymakers and also the other agents within the context of socioeconomic development to realize how important it is to focus and target certain individuals or even certain households in that nature. Right, so what is our aim here? Our aim here is just basically to assess and document the conditions of the targeted displaced community in terms of one, we are looking into understanding their social economic conditions in perspective, be it like income, their financial conditions, and also some of the important social elements, social dimensions within the context of the society. Yeah. And along the way, what we did is we did not only study about the current community itself, but we are also looking we also went into looking into the intergenerational mobility in terms of education and income of that particular community. So because the future of the community depends on their children in terms of how they move forward socioeconomically, and education and income becomes a critical juncture for them to move forward. Obviously, we did not do very rigorous assessment here in terms of intergenerational mobility, and the literature on this is quite extensive. But we try to map out kind of a movement of children compared to their parents in terms of education and income. So that will give us some kind of intuitive evidence about where they are with regards to their mobility when we compare that with their parents. Yeah. And of course, we went into just assessing some of the subjective well-being of the particular community. So we went into the household level to look into that. Yeah. We presume that this will provide and explore. I mean, we can explore more policy options, and it may provide more insights as well, and suggestions for the policymakers. Yeah. And of course, we have also provided policy briefs to the government. Of course, this has been a case, but we have also looked into a wider range of the Indian society to provide those policy options. So here, our attempt is not to compare the social economic condition of the displaced community before and after, when they were in the estate, and then when they came to the urban areas, when they were relocated. So our attempt is not to compare that, but our attempt is to draw lessons and understand the current state of the displaced community. So that is a perspective that we have taken. Because comparing before and after may not be viable, because that has been about 20 years back. But of course, the critical question to ask is where they are now, which is very, very important for policy description in the future. Okay, so the approach that we have taken, so in total, as I told you earlier, there are about 4 plantation estates which have been relocated. There are about 400 families involved. But because it has been about 20 years, we can't track all of them. So we applied a strict criteria for screening. We ensure that all the respondents who are involved in the survey, who are involved in the interviews, are those who are really from the estates who have been relocated. So that we have 2 groups here, basically the first generation who have been relocated, and the second generation who also have an experience of being in the plantation and then being relocated. Right. So in total, there were about 147 who are eligible. So when we went to house, we found out that some of them have moved out from the place, from the location. There's a lot of unoccupied houses. Some even moved out and rented their flats to others. And also in attempt to do the field work, we also failed to get certain households to engage in the survey. And so there are also a few failure cases in terms of attempting them to involve in the survey. So then in total, we had about 147 who are eligible for the survey itself. Yeah. And out of that, only 141 was used for analysis. So the method we used is basically survey questionnaires. This is not a self-administrative questionnaire, but it is more of a interview administrative questionnaire. We employed enumerators to undertake this survey. It took us about a month for us to complete the entire survey. And all the enumerators was trained from the beginning, so that we ensure that there is kind of to ensure the data quality and so forth. Apart from that, we also observe their living conditions in the particular flats. So observation data was also critical here for us to understand them further. And selectively, we have also interviewed some of the households to understand the narrative behind what is happening in the context of the household, and also to understand some of the data that we have collected. So when we analyze, we observe certain interesting findings and observation. So for that, we also supplemented that with interviews. Yeah, so to know more about what is happening within the particular community. Right? So that is the approach that we have taken. So it's more of, I would say, exploratory, but we are trying to get a bit of hard data so that we can situate the community in the right place so that people can understand where they are in terms of progress. Yeah. So let me give you a kind of profile of the community. So this is just the head of households in terms of the education, occupation, and working sector. You say that, in terms of education, they are not very highly educated in that context. So nearly about 50% of them only have kind of primary education. Even those who have never been to school is about 12%. So a large portion of the household head do not have education in that sense. Yeah? So in that context, viability becomes a critical issue. Yeah? And in terms of occupation, most of them are trapped in a lower range of occupation. Yeah? When you say they work as odd labor in this context. Of course, one or two have been progressive in terms of moving forward in terms of occupation ladder. But in general, we see most of them working as like laborer with someone, like cleaner, drivers, gardeners, and so on. So that is the level of occupation among head of households in this context. And majority of them are working in the private sector. So, so they work with some firms or companies in this regard. Yeah. And within the context of working members in the household itself, most of them have at least one or two other working members within the context of the household. So that they themselves plus their children. So that gives you kind of indication about the number of working members within the context of the household itself. So that includes the head of the household itself. So this gives you a kind of background about the respondents, about the head of household and where they are, where they're coming from in that context. Okay, let's discuss a bit on the key findings. So I'm just using some graphing method and also some descriptive statistics to explain to you about the earning of the head of household and their children. So if you look at the distribution of the income of the head of household and their children, then we can see that it is skewed towards the left, meaning say they are the lower portion of the income. So the mean income is about 1,424 for the head of household, while for the working children, the mean income is about 1,477. Yeah. And if you look at the range of income that they're earning, is about like 300 to 4,500. Those in the higher end of the income are very few, like more than 3,000 is very few in that context. Yeah. So what this suggests is that the earning capacity of the head of household, or even to the matter of their children, are still very low. So the income profile shows that they are not moving that closely to be compared with the income level of general population within the context of Malaysia. Even if you compare with say B40, they are not moving in tandem with that progress. So I would say that it is very limited in terms of earning capacity of the society, of the community, and that requires a lot of thinking about how we could improve their earning capacity in that context. And we also see that there are kind of gender dimension towards their earning capacity, given the fact that women has lesser opportunity in that context. Yeah? And also, if you look at the occupational class for the women, it's a bit different than compared to the men. And that has also substantially differentiated the income earning capacity between the men and the women in this context. I think that is what is observed elsewhere as well. So that really confirms the literature on gender inequality that we have within the context of the displaced community. Right? And they also have lesser skill sets in that context, which limits them to move forward. So this just to give you a kind of brief understanding about their income earning. So if you're taking the current poverty line argument about your earning per household, right? Uh, then we also see that they are within the context of the below the 50 line. So, but this may not give you the right indication. But next slide, when I show you the mean income for the household itself, then that could provide you a better indication. So I was talking about the gender inequality in terms of income earning. So we see that the male is earning more than the female. Yeah. So that is just looking into the disparity in terms of earning. Yeah. So in this particular graph, I've shown you the disparity. So the red line is just the mean income for the whole population, and then one is the male respondents' income, and 0 is the female respondents' income. So you can see some disparity there. Yeah. And then in terms of education, so 0 is no education to up to 6, which is higher education. You also see a lot of disparity in terms of income, right? So at large, we also try to see what matters for this income earning, what explains the income earning. So we just run a basic baseline kind of regression here, looking into gender, education, and experience to see to what extent this contributes to the income earning of the particular community. And we found out that obviously education was critical, and there's a disparity between sex, male and female here, which was significant in terms of explaining the variation in the income itself. But what is interesting here is basically the variable on experience. What we are seeing currently is that experience does not really uh, make any contribution to explain the variation in the income. Yeah, so that is very critical because we saw that many of them within the community do not have adequate education. So the only other options they have is to improve their experience in the particular occupation and then use that to drive the income earning. Yeah? But sadly, that did not happen within the context of this displaced community. Right? A year of experience or even 10 years of experience does not add any value to the income earning of the particular community. Why is it so? Because it is largely because they are trapped in occupational class where experience does not bring any additional kind of premium for them to earn additional income. Right? So the particular sector or industry they are engaged in does not really appreciate experience in that nature. Right? And that is very critical because that's the only tool that they have. That's the only tool that they have to improve their income earnings. Given that education is not a possible solution for them right now, right? So this is puzzling, and I think we require a better policy drive here to look into why that occupational class that we are talking about, where not only this community are involved, but most of the poor are involved, are not moving forward in terms of paying additional, kind of income when they have better experience. Say so you be a lorry driver, for instance, you drive lorry for about 20 years. That does not add much to your income. Okay, so the experience don't count that, right? So it's very important for us to look into how we can upgrade this industry in one hand to make them to be to be liable to even pay more for more experienced staff, and also to see how, on the other hand, you can upscale the people who are involved in this kind of occupation, so that they can move up the ladder in terms of even upgrading themselves into different kind of occupational class, right? So that is critical here. And if we bring this kind of policy changes, it will not only help this community, but it will help many others within the context of those who are working in the particular occupational course. Right? I think that kind of targeting is important for us to understand, right? So the notion of creating good jobs is very important here. That's what we are talking about. So how do we create good jobs for those who are in the B40, for instance? Yeah. So that has been very critical, and the policy choices for that is very critical, and it's very complex in terms of how we move forward in terms of upgrading this industry, and also upgrading the skill set of the community who are involved in this particular occupation. Right. So I put up some arguments here saying that those within the secondary education earn above the mean. Nevertheless, if you look at the community composition, then we see that 72% of the head households only have lesser than primary education, and that don't really bring any additional kind of income earning for them. Yeah, so here the education doesn't matter for this 72% of the head households. Yeah, so they are still trapped in that context. Yeah. So when we ask further, then we also realize that they are basically living with the support of the children to some end, to one extent, and also, I mean, the cash transfer, one-off cash transfer also was helpful, but that is not a kind of long-term solution, as I did earlier. They are very dependent on other people in order to even survive in the daily life. So that is the context that I'm giving to you. So I think this is interesting in terms of looking at experience, why experience is not adding any value to the income earning of the community. And I suspect that this will be true for many others, regardless of which community, if they are trapped in the same kind of occupational class. Right, let's explore this further in terms of income status. So we kind of calculated the mean and median income of the household for the displaced community, and as you can see, that is far lower than compared even if you just take the average of B40 or even the median of B40. Yeah. So it's way low than compared to the benchmark that I've put up here. Yeah. So then we can put up a narrative saying that they are not kind of progressing this nature. So this does not reflect the true inclusiveness in terms of moving forward for this particular community. In fact, 96% of the household do not have any other source of income. So we also asked them whether they have any other source of income, what is their employment opportunity, what do they think about their employment opportunity, not only for themselves, but also for their children. And many of them are very kind of pessimistic in terms of the future, right? So it's not only hard data that we have collected, we've also collected the perception of the household with regards to their own standing about their future in terms of income earning, and also their perception on their children. How optimistic are they in terms of moving forward for the next generation, for instance? Yeah. So of course, that also aligns well with where they are currently in terms of their earning itself. And I think more need to be done in terms of helping this community to move forward. I did not share those kind of data here, but we do have those kind of data to substantiate their kind of perception for future engagement in terms of how they would progress in the future. So what they think about the future progress for the community itself. Okay, so that being, I mean, just income status, the conditions of the community, we also went into exploring the income sustainability of the particular community, the households, and also their financial conditions. So we looked into many aspects of it. One is to see to how how long they can sustain their income. So if say so they lose a job, for instance, and what will be how long can they sustain in terms of months. So what we found out is that majority of them cannot even sustain within a month, right? Or at least, the most they can go is like 3 months, 2 months to 3 months. So that is a worrying trend because 93% of them are not able to sustain themselves without an income beyond 3 months in that context. Yeah. And because their saving is very low, and some of them don't really have saving. If you look at their income, they say that the income is only allows them to meet the daily expenses. About nearly about 78% of the households agrees with those kind of statements. So it's not only about the current state in terms of income sustainability of the household, but we also looked into the current financial conditions of the household, asking them questions with regards to how they were back. When they compare current situation and back 5 years back, what is their conditions like? So, so those kind of surveys are being done. We kind of engage in the perception of them in terms of financial conditions, and interestingly, that shows that nearly about 60% of them are not able to exhibit a better financial condition compared to 5 years back. They either report that they are at the same level, or somewhat worse, or much worse. So you can see that above the same level is about 20%, and then somewhat worse is about 32%, and much worse is about 8%. So that composition, I think some part of the society, the community itself, the household itself, are having difficulties in terms of maintaining in terms of having better financial conditions as compared to 5 years. So that gives you a kind of longitudinal perspective about what happens within these 5 years. Are they moving forward in terms of financial conditions? Right? And we do ask a lot of other questions like, how are they managing the finance? Whether they are living comfortably, are they doing okay, or just getting by, or are they finding it difficult, and so forth. I think that also reflects the same thing that you see in the table in the middle in terms of current financial conditions. About 50+% saying that they are just getting by, and also they are finding it difficult to get by. Yeah, so that is about 16%. And then we further explored about the future investment that they've done. So about 55% of them are not involved in any form of investment. Even those who are involved in investment, those who said yes, that is basically some limited types of investment that does not really provide you the return, right? Like insurance and amanah saham. Even that is very, very low. Yeah. So I think government is also looking into financial inclusion in that context, but for this community, it does not happen. Yeah. So there's a lot of argument about how to move the B40, for instance, to be more inclusive in terms of the financial market in that context. But we don't see that happening quite progressively for this particular case. Yeah. And in terms of sufficiency for saving, whether their income is sufficient for saving, I think 73% of them have said no. So meaning say they can only survive the income for their daily expenses. So this pictures kind of worsening situation of the financial condition of the particular community, which requires a lot of attention in the future. Yeah. And I think better policy making is required for addressing this. And it's a challenging process within the context of moving forward towards financial inclusion for the poor. Yeah. Of course, we have a lot of kind of programs, microfinance, and various types of programs. In terms of programs, we have many, but I think it is not reaching the intended clients in that context. So I think more is required to see how and in what ways we can position these kind of programs and also policies so that it can be effective for community which deserves it in terms of needs, right? So I think programs should be looked at based on the needs that the particular community is deprived of, for instance. All right, so let me also share with you some findings on intergenerational mobility. So we were not only interested in looking into the head of households, but also the future generation within the context of the household. So what we did is we did a simple mapping to see how much they've improved, the children has improved versus compared to their parents in terms of education, whether they have moved up the ladder with this within this context. Yeah. Right. So I have only 5 minutes left. All right. So I move faster. Right. So what we see here is basically that we see that 68% of the children shows upward mobility, but the mobility is also only at 1 or 2 levels. So the meaning say they are better than their parents at 1 or 2 levels in terms of education. Yeah. So if the parents have primary education, then the children may have secondary education. So when we map up this, I think 55% of them have only moved 1 or 2 levels. We already know that households, the parents are having lower education, so 1 or 2 level higher does not make any significant changes to the income earnings later, right? But interestingly, we also see that some of them are regressing in terms of education attainment. That requires a lot of attention, I guess, because they're not doing well even to the extent of their parents' education, right? So that happens in some of the households. I'll tell you why this happens in a moment. And we also mapped up the children, first children, second children, third children, and to see how they are moving up in terms of education. And we find that second and third children has a better opportunity to move up than the first children. So that is what we observe, and I think it's critical for us to address this as well. And I think the parents are depending too much on the first children and depriving some of their education opportunities in that context. Yeah. Let me move on. So why is that there is a regress in terms of education attainment among children? What we found out is that the dropout cases are quite high within this community. They are about 28% of the total sample that we have, those within the context of studying children. 28% of the households we see a dropout cases, at least one dropout cases within the context of the schooling. Yeah. And when we go into the reasons why there's a dropout, then we found out that financial constraints and family problems are the main reasons that is being quoted. Yeah. So that contributes to the interest of the student not having interest in education and moving forward. So I think for this community, we need to look into the issue of dropouts, okay, in a more detailed way, so that we can address those concerns. In terms of intergenerational mobility, in terms of income, we did not do a very kind of advanced assessment in terms of looking at what is the effect of father's income on children's income, but we rather mapped up the mean and median income between parents and children, and we see that there is not much differences in terms of the median and mean income. Yeah. Given that education, skills, and experience does not add that much towards income earning, I think this particular graph still stands in terms of explaining the differences between parents and children, because we don't see any other variable covariates which can largely linked to the differences. Yeah. So I think the reason being that they are still trapped in the same occupational class, and because value does not, experience does not add any value to their income. they're still trapped. Yeah, so I think the concept of the origin of the community is very important here, and they are within the same set of kind of class, and that is not moving anywhere further. We also found that social network are very limited within this community, and that limits many of the attainment in terms of even education. Yeah? So their exposure in terms of information, knowledge are very, very limited, right? So that is what this graph is showing, but we are linking this to other social economic conditions that they are experiencing within the context of the community. Yeah? So I think largely they are within the family members. They have lesser interaction with other people, and that limits the ability to capture the network benefits within the context of the community. So this is just to tell you what is happening within the context of them moving forward in terms of mobility. Some social issues are also being discovered. I mean, gangsterism is among them, and that also contributes why, I mean, in a way, why they are dropping out, in terms of schooling, and the poor living environment and so on is also contributing to some extent to some of these conditions that we observed earlier. Right? So gangsterism, poor living conditions are becoming a key. So key variables to even to explain some of the other variations that we see. I'll go a bit faster because I think I have very limited time now. In terms of subjective well-being, we just used a simple measurement to look into the life satisfaction among the households, and I think slightly higher, about 55% of them are not really satisfied with their life. Yeah? So that is what this particular table is showing. But we also have looked at the distribution where they are in the context of each of the items that is being measured for the context of the and subjective well-being. So there are some part of a community within the context of the displaced community who are satisfied, but I mean largely we also see a big portion of the households are not satisfied with their life. And we also look into their satisfaction within the context of family members, within the context of neighbor and surrounding environment. So this is the outcome. So we see that certain households are not really satisfied with the family relation with neighbors, relation with the surrounding environment that they do have. Yeah. So that explains. So if you look at this particular, those which is above 4, so those are the responses that we get within the context of whether they are satisfied with regards to family relation, neighbor, and environment. We kind of run certain regression to see what matters for the subjective well-being, and we found out that the critical elements here are being family relation, living environment, and financial stability. So these 3 are key variables that are really affecting the way that people feel about their life. Yeah, so in terms of happiness, say so. Yeah? And also the neighbor relationship. Yeah? So it's more of a psychometric kind of, factors that is affecting them in terms of their life satisfaction in this context. Yeah? So this gives you a kind of implication about what can be done for us to improve the subjective well-being of the community itself. Right. So some policy implication for me to conclude here. So I think critical is about the employment and labor market and also the labor law. I think it's very critical for us to identify the occupation class of the poor and undertake a targeted program to strengthen the employment opportunity, including the ability to generate other sources of income. And it is equally important for us to educate the vulnerable groups to know their rights, and equally important for us to create an awareness program, say so, about workers' rights and so on. Yeah, I think there are some form of discrimination, and they are not aware of those discrimination, and they are paid very low in some aspects of the jobs. I think that should be looked at And I think we can use labor law adequately in terms of addressing some of this inequality that happen within the context of the labor market, the employment market stuff. Yeah. They are already vulnerable and they are being kind of displaced in terms of even giving them right wages and salary in that context. Yeah. So I think we need to play with the right policy so that we can uplift the community. Obviously, the other aspect is upskilling of the poor pro-occupational class within the context of the society. I think that is required, but only upscaling will not happen. It will not be very effective. You have to also look in the industry itself, how to upgrade the industry, so that they value those kind of upgrading within the context of the industry, so that the skill sets are appreciated by the industry, by the employer, the experience are being appreciated by the employer, and so forth. So I think that requires some thinking. And also social illness, because these social illness are bringing a lot of multiple implications for the society. One is the school dropout programs. I think that is critical, not only for this community, but at large for many of the poor other societies. I think we need to have more focus and targeted programs in this context. We do have NGOs who are doing well in terms of bringing skills to the school dropouts, giving them kind of different types of education so that they can survive and they can have a better livelihood in that context. I think the focus can also be at the school level, even looking into enforcement of police inspection and so forth, so that you can reduce crime rate. All these are very interrelated within the context of the community that we need to look into. Yeah. Of course, drug, alcohol, and gangsterism. So kind of there's a lot of implications towards how they're progressing, where they are now in the context of the society. Right. So as a conclusion, sorry. Right. So in terms of social conditions, I think there's clear evidence that the society is lagging behind, including in education attainment, and also the education premium is low for this particular community, and we don't really see much intergenerational mobility in that context as well. And I think we need to look into how to stabilize financially the particular community, provide them support system, and also how do we improve living conditions in that context. I think we need to also focus looking into school dropouts, intergenerational mobility, women empowerment, or even the issue of occupational class, which is labor-related issues. And so in that context, I think these are some of the lessons that we can bring back within the context of the community. What we were doing after the research is that basically we were more lobbying the policymakers and also working with NGOs to move forward. Yeah. I think that is what is very important agenda that we had as a researcher, because I think that requires a lot of effort, and we exhausted our time and also effort moving into engaging NGOs and also many other government agencies within this context. Yeah. So sadly to say, the publication have taken a backseat in this context, because lobbying for policy changes are a very tedious job, and that requires a lot of effort. Of course, we are working on the paper now, and we are going to move into submitting that. So this is in terms of what we have done within context of knowledge dissemination of the research work. And I think I'm done here. Thank you very much. I believe that proper policy and plans can further liberate the society, the community itself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Chandran, for a very insightful and enlightened presentation. Now it's time for question and answers, and I believe there are questions that have been put forward by the audience. First, I noticed first questions in the chat. Yeah. is from Dr. Sharifah Muhaira. Yeah, she says that it's interesting to know about observation method being used in the study. She would appreciate some clarification on this observation method. That's the first question from her. The second is, overall, do you see any improvement in terms of income and education for the daughters in the community? Is there a large gap between sons and daughters on education and income? That's from Dr. Sharifah Mahira. Dr. Chandran, can you please answer?
Okay. What is the first one? Sorry, I
The, fir-
understand the second one.
the first one is observation method that you have mentioned you use in your study.
Mhm.
Can you give some clarification on the observation methods?
Observation is basically to mean when we talked about. I mean, some of these I've not presented here, but when we talk about the living conditions in the houses itself, so what we did is we observe what they have and what they don't. Uh, Even looking into certain assets that they have within the context of the household. So that those kind of observation was critical for us to kind of validate our answers that we had using the questionnaire. So at least that will give you kind of information about where they are in terms of their living standards. That perspective. Yeah. I did not post some of the narratives that they have given us, like codes and other things. So that is also available in the full report. Because I thought that I need to limit my slides, so many of these things are not being looked at. So I did not leave those things. But obviously we do have other evidences to support some of these claims that we are making here. With regards to whether there's any differences between daughter and son, we did not go into looking into gender in that context between the children. We just did a simple kind of differences that they had. I mean, comparing the parents and also the children. We did not go into very rigorous assessment. Uh, so that could be some limitation that we have within the context of the study. Because when we look into those working children, even our sample becomes smaller in that context. So there is no, I mean, we can't do a lot of statistical analysis in that context. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Muhara, and thank you, Dr. Chandran, for posting the answer. Um, there is rather a suggestion by Jayanti. Prof. Chandran, the policy suggestion should be to establish a non-profit organization, neither government body nor NGO, to assist them, and the onus is on the institution for accountability. Second, target women who will manage their family and income earned and are motivated to escape their socio-economic background. She has given example, Prof. Yunus Noble always targeted women and succeeded throughout the world. So can you, um, um, uh, this is the suggestion, I believe it's not a question, but can you give your insight on this suggestion, Dr. Chandran?
Yeah, sure. I did not specifically suggest for the establishment of non-profit organization. We already have a lot. But the notion is that even non-profit organizations are very weak within the context of Malaysia. Many of the NGOs do not have the capacity to even move forward in terms of making certain policy decisions and so on. They are not also a very strong group which pressures the government to move forward in uh, some of these cases. Yeah. So I think I mean there are some NGOs which are good like if I can mention My Skill, for instance. They are doing a very good job in terms of upskilling the dropout children and so on. So in that context, we do have some NGOs which are moving forward in terms of looking into the community itself. By and large, I think NGOs are still weak with this context. We have not liberated them to move forward even further. I think they might also require support, and just depending on government support to run the NGOs may not be a sufficient way of how you should position your NGOs to move forward. I think more is required there, but I think the moral obligation should be taken by the state, by the government itself. So I think uh, the issue is how much information do we have so that we can do a more informed policy decision in that context.
Yes.
I think many of it is not being, I mean, we don't know, we know that pockets of poverty here and there, but we are not taking a more holistic approach. If you want to do that, then I think it's very important for you to go even to district level to identify those things. So the first question to ask among the policymakers, who are the poor, right? So if you answer that question, then you may
Yeah.
have a better idea about who the poor are. Then how do you classify them as a poor? Is income is adequate enough? So even when the Indian government involved in identifying poor, then they discovered that process is not a very simple process because there's a lot of heterogeneity in that context. Yeah. So how do we do that? Even if you look at assets they have, even that if they went into that level, they have a lot of subdivisions to look into who the poor are and so on. So I think we don't really have adequate data in that sense. Even to the fact that we don't really have adequate database in order to identify the poor. The only database that we have is for the cash transfer that we have done. Like Dream, for instance, we have a list of eligible individuals. But I think those data sets need to be shared with many other organizations. Another critical issue is that the relationship between government and NGOs and other agents which are involved. I think that should be strengthened further because a lot of information is not shared. So when you don't share information, what will happen is that other organizations may not be able to take advantage of those information and do a targeted policy in that context. Yeah, I may
Yeah.
have a good intention that I want to help certain people through my NGO, but if I don't have adequate information, then when I target the clients, the recipients of certain say programs and so on, when we don't have adequate information, then we may not be achieving or giving those kind of services to the right people. So I think those kind of sharing is very critical. Those kind of coordination is very critical on the part of the government and also for other agents. Yeah, even in fact for universities, we have a lot of research, but it's also scattered around. We are not compiling it in a way that it will benefit the society at large. So
Yeah.
that's why I thought that publication, let's take that at the back seat. Let's do
Right.
the lobbying of the policy change. Let's engage in that first, then move into publication part of it. And
Right. Yeah.
critically, even for social research centers, I believe that KPI should be more on how do you make improvement to the society.
Yeah.
That is
Bringing
much,
down research to
yeah.
society.
So,
Yeah.
so that is more critical than just solely concentrating on uh, publication as a KPI. I think that
Right.
should be translated down from higher authority like Ministry of Education,
Yeah.
because social research is a bit different than compared to others.
Yeah.
But you may make
Indeed.
differences to the life. Yeah.
Yeah. Indeed. Now, we also have 5 questions from Prof. Nias. The first one is, how did you define the intergenerational mobility, the
Mhm.
IG mobility? Methodologically speaking, how does comparing education, income levels by groups, parents versus children say anything about mobility? So that's his first question. The second one is about the claim about occupational trap is intriguing. Um, the empirical analysis is in an absolute space except the graph on income. So methodologically speaking, how did you reach that conclusion about occupational trap, gender inequality in the displaced community, and education being very low? So that's the second question. The third, what is missing, you refer to strong evidence that Indian community is left behind. But what is the evidence? Um, he didn't see references to any study on this. Okay, probably use. Yeah, you can answer that. So okay, that's number 3. Number 4. Also, in what dimension are they left behind? Is it in absolute sense or relative? 20 years ago, many Tubumi Putras were also um, left behind. So that's his 4th question regarding the dimensions that you talk about being left behind. Question number 5. It's not a question. He says, Prof. Nia says that I'm asking this. I don't see the exact academic contribution of your study to the wider literature on DID since there's no mention of any existing evidence, local or international. So, can Dr. Chandran respond to this?
Yeah, I'll respond to some of this.
Yes, thank you.
See, the intergenerational mobility, we have taken a very loose kind of assessment, looking into how they were doing in terms of education compared to their parents. But that is, I mean, we did not go into sophisticated analysis in terms of methodological approach. We thought that just comparing the education level of the parents and children will give us some kind of intuition in terms of moving forward. So that is the approach that we have taken. So it's more exploratory in that nature. Even the sampling size is too small for us to do any rigorous assessment in that context. So we did not go into that. We tried, but we did not go into that. So in that context, it's a very loosely argued perspective of intergenerational mobility in that context. Yeah. Of course, what we are doing currently is that we are taking more samples. We have done samples from Bukit Jalil, those displaced community. We had about 60 households, and we also searching to include more. So once we get the entire data set, then we are going to move into looking into it more rigorous way in terms of even defining what is intergenerational mobility in that context. So for now, it may not be that rigorous if you compare, but we were pushing through this analysis because we wanted to give the outcome for the 12 action plan. At least they will have a sense about where this community has moved forward in that context. In terms of occupational trap, what we have looked into, we have divided occupational class based on the standard description that we have within the context of the occupation itself. And then we try to map out, where the children are within the occupational class, and then whether there's any movement. But of course, there's a lot of complexity in that. But looking into the occupational class plus the income they're earning within the occupational class, gives us kind of intuition about whether there is an occupational trap in that context. So that's what we have done for that. So it's entirely kind of absolute space that we are looking into, rather than doing a relative kind of assessment in that context. And the third one, strong evidence is left out. What is the evidence? Okay, I did not see in this slide. I did not cite anyone. I did not take a kind of academic approach in this context, giving you references and so on. But obviously in the full write-up we have those things. Yeah? So I did not highlight those things. I thought it will be more penetrable for audience who are laymen to understand. So I've crafted those presentation in that way, rather than being too academic. I believe that policymakers require to understand them in a very simple way. So that's where I went. And I couldn't see the other questions. It's missing from here. But obviously, some of these things that Nias have highlighted.
Prof. Prof. Nias also asked Dr. Chandran about in what dimension were they left behind? Is it absolute sense or relative?
It's more of an absolute sense rather than relative here. We do not compare with other communities as well. Obviously, I mean, other community can also be left behind. I'm not saying they are not, but I'm just looking within the community itself and then seeing where they are. So that is what we have done in that context. Yeah. And number five, exact academic contribution. I think that I mean I mentioned earlier. I did not cite
Yeah,
any that context. There is a lot of existing evidences in this context, but lacking in the context of an Indian community, which I can bring that up even by citing a lot of literature. So I did not take that approach in this context.
yeah. Understood. Yeah. Okay. Questions from Jackie. Since the upskilling program is vital to these communities, do we have some low-hanging fruits that can be adopted currently? What about the long-run upskilling approaches?
Okay, it's a very complex issue to answer because there's a lot of complexity within the context of, I mean, even the causality of how certain things affect, that's why I don't really want to take the approach of like modeling and so forth because it's very hard to really find out the exact causal relationship within this context. There are multiple issues that is affecting them. There's not one issue, but multiple issues. So, in understanding how that really features within the community is important. I think even when I talked about like why are they dropping out, the dropout is not only because the family situation, but also the surrounding environment, for instance. Yeah. So it's kind of multiple factors are playing a role within the context of the community. So if you ask me about low-hanging fruits, it's very difficult to say what are the low-hanging fruit. But I think it's not about whether we want to move into low-hanging fruit, but how do we design, say, so kind of more sustainable policy so that we can help them. Because if you are talking about low-hanging fruit, you always go for the short-term gains in the short run, and that
True.
will not bring anything. I can give you a lot of examples, like even when you do upskilling, for instance, uh, when you're doing upskilling for society, for instance. Yeah, I'll give you an example. There's a lot of NGOs, a lot of institutions which are running upskilling programs in terms of giving them training. Okay. Um, my question is, if you just give them a training skill set, for instance, uh, how useful will that be for them? Right? So of course, after the training program, you get those knowledge. But say so, I'm giving you some kind of business skills, business training for you to start up micro businesses, for instance. So those training will be very helpful in terms of knowledge. But if I don't have capital to start up the business, if the training program don't come with other elements of it, like capital, for instance, then you are unable to use the knowledge that you've gained within the context. So a piecemeal approach will not work. So in this context, so you have to have an entire range of programs which can bring change to the household itself. So I think that is more important than trying to pick up kind of the low-hanging fruits and moving forward. That can be very temporary kind of solutions that you are looking at, but that couldn't sustain them. Couldn't sustain them. Even when you give cash and out, it's a matter of how they are using those cash and outs. Whether that cash and outs will be important. Uh, what is the purpose of them using it? Yeah. How do we design better cash and outs? Should it be a more kind of conditional cash transfer, for instance? Say so you're giving some kind of cash transfer for children's education, for instance. Yeah. So those are the things that even in the literature there's a lot for us to understand how do we operate those policies. So the issue is, I'm not saying that government has not been involved in helping the society. They were involved in helping them. But I'm talking about how do we design the program in a way that it will be beneficial in the, so that we can bring in more effective programs so that the so-called society or community will be much better off. So if you just go for short gains, I don't think so that would be very helpful in that context. So
So,
yeah.
so do you have a suggestion for the long run upscaling approach that Jackie asked?
Yeah, wrong run. I think there are some, workable models like Cocoon, for instance. They have better models which we can also extend that to other uh, vulnerable society uh, households. I think that kind of expansion may be required, so to move forward. So if you look at the Cocoon's kind of even training programs and so on, it's well designed because they have got a lot of feedback of
Yeah.
how on how effective the programs are and so forth. So I think there are a lot of workable models. Only that we need to see how that fits into the different setting of the society. So because their background culture also matters in that context. It's different, totally different.
Yeah. All right.
So that need to be looked at too.
Okay. Thank you, Chandran. A question from Amal. Um, Interesting. Could you explain more on the perception or awareness of the people in the community towards education and how it relates to poverty alleviation? Um, as what you explained earlier, that some of them are actually regressing in terms of education. So maybe this is related to why job experiences doesn't contribute to income increase. So this is from Amal. Chandran?
I think we have a very big role to do here in terms of education. I think, they do not have sufficient information about even how do they go into skill enhancement and so on. And I think the perception of the community, not only this Indian community, but also at large,
Yeah.
your polytechnics, vocational schooling, even technical kind of skill enhancement programs, they're not paying a lot of attention on that. I think many of them are very kind of driven to more academic programs. They think university and other things are more important than even other types of education system. And when you look into the other types of education uptake, it's very minimum. Even within the community of Indian community, they don't really have a good perception moving into technical education or even vocational education. So those kind of mindset need to change. Uh, One reason why they are looking into that in that perspective is basically because there's no career progression in that education. Because once you've done your diploma, for instance, or if you have done a certificate, where do you go next? So because there's no pathway for career and progression in terms of education, they are not seeing that as an important component of education.
Yeah, not to mention they regard this work as dirty and hard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is one. Yeah, so I think the industry itself must change in that respect.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think how do we create this kind of awareness among youngsters to take up this kind of skill enhanced kind of jobs, which is very very critical not only for the household but
Yeah.
for the nation itself. I mean,
Mm.
people are moving into skill based education programs. So I think we are too much concentrating on academic based program, which we don't require that actually for many aspects. Unless if you want to be a researcher and other things, then of course you require those kind of path. So the path is not clear. If you look at some of the countries, their education model, you see the path to be very clear where you want to move. If you want to go academically, then you have different paths. You want to go skill based, you have different paths. So I think we have a lot of work to do on that part.
Right.
Uh, I think the
Mm.
government is trying to create this kind of different paths for us to move, but convincing the households to move into this is very tedious. Even within the context of science-based and social sciences, we see
Yeah.
more moving into social sciences.
Yeah, probably the media also has to play a role in changing the
Yes, yes.
mindset of the people. Yeah, there's a question from Mr. Tim Barnell. Uh, Thanks for presenting this important work. You have referred to residents of Taman Permata as community. This is understandable in popular parlance, but what to what extent do the individuals and households concerned identify as collective a community? So I think Tim wants you to explain this, the term community.
Yeah, probably I've used the term community because they come from these estates. When they were in the estates, they were very collective in that sense. They know each other and so forth. So that is the notion that we used here. Even within the Taman, they're quite interactive in that context. So that past notion that they come from certain community was referred to. But we'll give a more thorough thought about the use of the word community.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
thank you for the suggestion.
Okay, there's one last question, I believe, from Associate Professor Dr. Baskaran. Did you ask the displaced households what kind of policy supports they think will help them to overcome the problems that they are facing? The kind of policy input from the community itself. Is there any way that this has been done?
Okay. No, we didn't ask them. We try to ask them, but I think they are not in a state of giving us the answers because their education level is low and so forth. I don't think so. We able to get any useful information by asking them about policy inputs. I think we need to figure out what will be the dynamics within the context of the society and how we could address that. Those which are critical, those which are critical. I think the policy brief and other lobbying that we did with EPU, Economic Planning Unit, and other agencies worked to some extent. If you look at the RM12, there are some issues that are highlighted here being addressed in the RM12, but I don't know what kind of programs they're going to come up with to really help the B40 in that context. But I'm still working with EPU and also with the Indian agency known as MITRA, Malaysian Indian Transformation Unit. So hopefully we can kind of draft some programs which will be more important. So I think to ensuring the proper implementation of program is critical in that sense.
Yes.
Ensure that there's no leakages in
Yeah.
the implementation of the programs are also
Yeah.
important in terms of money financing that's going into that. Sometimes we find a lot of leakages. It's not reaching the intended
Yeah.
people for those programs. So I think that is important to. So the governance of the policies and programs are critical.
Yeah, I believe there's one last question from Raymond from Law Faculty. The mindset of academic qualifications versus vocational qualifications seems to me to be endemic for Malaysia. I think it's not just Malaysia. Would a general reimagining of educational qualifications to place academic and vocational skill sets on par help in changing the perception of household and help them?
Actually, to answer this, I think we were last time we were moving in the right direction when we created these university colleges.
Yeah, yeah.
We had few university colleges which is emphasizing more on the technical aspect of it,
Mm,
so it's
mm,
less academic. But
mm.
over the years, what happened is that because of the race to move into ranking and other things, they also become an academic institution like others. So
Yeah,
we are
yeah.
not making a distinction between this. Yeah?
Mm, mm.
So I think the objective, the early objective that we had, like Unimap, for instance, many other universities, technical universities in Malacca and so on, were moving in the right direction. I think re-establishing that narrative is important for us to move into more skill-based kind of engagement. The other aspect that I found out is that certain professional bodies are not recognizing those kind of universities. So if that happens, then even if you be an engineer, for instance, for you to be a qualified engineer, you have to register with the Board of Engineers. if they are not recognizing those kind of academic qualification, which emphasizes more on the practice rather than the theory, then we have a big issue here. I was made to understand that if you are a graduate from, say, UNIMAP in engineering field, because you do more practical, like 70% practical and 30% theory, that don't really jive well with the professional qualification requirements. So I think if that is the case, I'm not sure what is the case now, but that is what I was made to understood. But if that is the case, then there is a blockage in terms of how they could move forward. Uh, I think the government also were experimenting about how do we emulate the type of education system that is in Germany, for instance, because they are very skill based. They are more concerned about the the practicality of what you studied in terms of your knowledge and skills, and how do you apply that. So I think those are uh, critical issues that we need to discuss. I think there's a lot of things to do to be done within the context of education. I think we require a revamp of the education system itself. There are multiple issues as well. Even um, financing education. How do you go about better financing education, right? I think sometimes we are. I mean, I don't know whether we are moving to the right direction. So public sector is also trying to act like private sector now. That is also kind of it may have an implication in the long run.
Yeah.
I think those kind of issues need to be looked into carefully. So how do you design this overall? I mean, we have liberalized education system, we have more private sector participation and so on. But how do you make sure that this contributes equally to all classes of society?
Okay, I think we have come to the end of the very, very insightful and interesting session, and we thank you very much to all participants that have attended this session, this morning session, and for the questions that has been posed. It's time for me to wrap up this session. I will give a short wrap up. I believe what you have presented is most important. The issue on development-induced displacement as a result of economic growth and development, especially from the Indian rubber tappers community, is something that needed a lot of attention, and the targeted and effective policy to help improve the well-being of the people, especially the children and future generation, is indeed crucial. So I think with that, I will end the webinar. I thank you once again for all the attendance, for Dr. Associate Professor Dr. Chandran for his presentation. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Thank you for
Good
hosting.
day. Yeah.